The oil lamp on Dr. Alistair Monroe's desk burned low, its flame trembling as if uncertain of its own existence. The smell of iodine mixed with coal dust and something faintly metallic, the way blood smells on cold instruments. Outside, Ash Hollow lay wrapped in its nightly quilt of fog, a quiet Tennessee town too small to be noticed by progress, too proud to be forgotten. The year was 1905, and time itself seemed to move slower here, as though it were still deciding whether to enter the modern age or remain in the dim corridors of superstition and faith. Inside that narrow wooden clinic, Dr. Monroe sat upright, spectacles glinting under the lamplight, writing with a precision that could almost be mistaken for devotion. The sound of his pen was the only heartbeat. The room seemed to have. He had once been celebrated as the prodigal, son of Ash Hollow, a doctor educated in Boston, the first to bring antiseptic practice and clinical detachment to a town that still believed in prayer over poultice. He had the posture of someone who believed himself chosen by science itself, and a smile that never reached his eyes. His patients called him Dr. Monroe, but his colleagues simply called him the rationalist. He never prayed, never crossed himself, never looked to the heavens for mercy. To him, mercy was an error in judgment, and faith was the fever of the uneducated. That autumn, the mills were coughing out smoke thicker than the sky could bear. Sickness crept through the narrow alleys like a rumor, fever, cough, fatigue, and despair. The poor came to the clinic clutching more faith than money, and Monroe, with his white coat starched and immaculate, turned their suffering into ledger lines and Latin diagnoses. Each illness was a failure of the body, not the soul, and he made certain his patients knew it. One evening, just as the fog began to settle against the windows, a knock broke the silence. His assistant opened the door, and two figures stepped inside, a man carrying his wife, her head lolling weakly against his shoulder. The woman's face was pale as wax, her breath shallow and uneven. "Please, doctor," the husband stammered, his voice fraying at the edges. "It's Eleanor. She's been fevered for days." Monroe didn't rise immediately. He finished writing the last line in his book, dotted the page, and only then looked up. His gaze swept over the woman as one might study a specimen. "Lay her down," he said, "and fetch water." His tone carried no comfort. Only command. Eleanor Price was a mill worker, 23, with the softness of youth still clinging to her face, even as sickness had hollowed it. Her hands trembled as she tried to clasp them together. She whispered something, a prayer. Faint as moth wings, Monroe's eyes flicked toward her lips, then narrowed. "If your God can cure you," he said quietly, almost kindly, "then you won't be needing me." The words cut deeper than any knife, and yet he smiled, as if amused by his own wit. Her prayer faltered. The husband bowed his head, shame mixing with fear. Monroe turned away, lighting a cigarette that glowed like a small, defiant ember in the gloom. "Fever," he murmured, jotting it down. Hysteria brought on by fatigue and rural superstition. That night stretched long and cruel. The clinic smelled of wet wood and sweat. Outside, the fog pressed harder against the glass. Trying to find its way inside, Eleanor's breathing grew ragged, then softer, until it was indistinguishable from the sound of the wind. Her husband begged Monroe to stay, to try another tonic, another injection, anything. But the doctor simply watched the dying flame of his lamp. "There is nothing left to do," he said, "except let nature finish what it began." And when she went still, he did not close her eyes. He merely turned back to his desk, wrote the date beside her name, and under cause of death scrawled a single word: hysteria. Her husband buried her 2 days later in the small churchyard by the river. The town's women brought candles. The men stood in silence. The priest spoke softly of mercy and forgiveness. Monroe did not attend. He sat in his office, reading medical journals, pretending not to hear the toll of the church bell. When his assistant returned, pale and shaken, saying that the doctor's name had been whispered among the mourners, Monroe laughed, a dry, sharp sound that startled even himself. That evening, he washed his hands longer than usual. The water was cold, too cold for early autumn. He blamed the pipes, though they had never been faulty before. The reflection staring back at him in the small mirror above the basin seemed older, sharper, eyes rimmed with something he refused to name. For the first time, he thought he heard something beneath the sound of the faucet, a voice, almost imperceptible, forming his name. He shook his head and turned off the tap, but the whisper lingered, curling in the corners of the room like smoke that wouldn't dissipate. Days passed. The mill resumed its churning rhythm. Monroe saw new patients, though fewer came than before. Some preferred the midwife again, others the priest. He dismissed it all as ignorance, yet each night the clinic grew colder. His instruments began to rust, and the smell of decay, faint but persistent, clung to the walls. Once, he found the rosary that had belonged to Eleanor Price lying on his desk. His assistant swore he hadn't brought it there. Monroe locked it in a drawer and told himself it was simply a mistake, a trick of memory, but that night he dreamt of her, standing by his desk, her lips moving soundlessly in prayer, while his own voice laughed back at her. He awoke before dawn, his heart pounding. The lamp had burned out, but the air was thick with the scent of candle wax, though none had been lit. He sat upright, listening. The wind outside pressed gently at the shutters, carrying with it that same fragile murmur, the one that knew his name. For weeks he told no one, though the town began to talk. The widow of a patient claimed to have seen light flickering in the doctor's window long after midnight, like someone pacing the floors. A boy swore he heard a woman's voice singing a hymn from within the clinic, though no one else had been there. Monroe laughed when he heard the gossip, but his laughter grew thin. He stopped writing letters to his colleagues. His coffee went untouched. He began sleeping at his desk, ledger open beside him, as if afraid the house itself would accuse him if left alone too long. Then one evening, while sorting through case files, he found a small stain on the edge of Eleanor's page. It looked like a fingerprint, dark and slightly oily. He tried to rub it off, but it wouldn't lift. Beneath it, the ink had bled, distorting the word hysteria until it looked like something else entirely, history. He stared at it for a long time, unable to move. A draft passed through the room, though the windows were closed, and the pages of his ledger turned themselves to a blank space near the back. There a single sentence appeared, faint, as though written in dust rather than ink. Some truths don't stay buried. He slammed the book shut. For the first time in years, he felt the tremor of something like fear, not of death, but of consequence. He extinguished the lamp and sat in the dark, listening to the creak of the walls and the rhythm of his own heartbeat. It was then he realized the heartbeat didn't match his own. There was another, softer, slower, like someone breathing through water. He rose, opened the door and stepped into the corridor. The air was colder there, and the faint outline of footsteps marked the floorboards ahead of him, wet as though someone had walked in from the rain. But there had been no rain that night. By morning the fog had lifted from Ash Hollow, but not from his mind. He carried on as before, attending to patients, polishing his instruments, pretending not to see the rosary that had returned once again to his desk. The town saw only the proud doctor, still sharp, still unshaken. But those who passed his clinic at night noticed how the lamp now burned through till dawn, its light wavering as though fighting a wind that wasn't there. And sometimes, when the night was still and the river's current whispered against the stones, a passerby could hear what sounded like a man speaking softly to himself, over and over the same words, "If your God can cure you," followed by silence so deep it felt like prayer. Because in Ash Hollow, some whispers never leave the room where they began, and some names, like the sound of a pen scratching across a ledger, echo long after the ink has dried. The death was filed away, as most poor deaths were, folded into the back pages of a ledger and forgotten by everyone except the wind that passed through Ash Hollow's crooked streets. The ink dried. The papers were stacked, and in Dr. Alistair Monroe's clinic, life went on with clinical precision. The doctor's hands still moved with that same cold grace, steady and mechanical, like clockwork wound too tight. He did not think of Eleanor Price. He did not let himself. Her name became another mark in a growing list of the defeated, another note beneath the glass dome of his scientific pride. He told himself that faith was a fever, and he was its cure. Word of his skill spread beyond the town limits. Farmers from the next county came limping through the fog to see him. Mothers brought their coughing children in bundles of blankets, whispering about the doctor who never prayed but always healed. He had become something of a legend, a man who knew better than God. That was the phrase that followed him. Now, some said it in awe, others said it in warning. Yet in every story there was a tone of unease, like a hymn sung one note off key. But the older women of Ash Hollow, those who lived on the far edge of the river, stopped crossing his path altogether. They would pull their shawls tighter when his carriage passed. The priest no longer nodded to him during Sunday. Walks and the bell at St. Mary's, the one that had once tolled for the sick and the saved, never rang when Monroe passed its steeple. It was as if the whole town had agreed to hold its breath in his presence, to treat him as something not cursed, but contaminated. Inside the clinic, the air began to change. It started small. A coppery smell that clung to his instruments even after scrubbing, the faint hiss of air escaping from sealed bottles, a coldness that lived only in certain corners of the room. Monroe dismissed each as coincidence. He had no patience for the poetry of superstition. When his lamp began to flicker out at midnight every night, precisely as the clock struck 12, he merely tightened the wick and cursed the oil. When the mirror above his basin grew cloudy, no matter how often he polished it, he blamed the Tennessee humidity. But deep down, beneath the thin walls of his certainty, something had begun to whisper. He called it nonsense, he called it fatigue, but guilt is a patient disease. It settles in the bloodstream, silent at first and waits for stillness. It was in that stillness, in the soft hush between one heartbeat and the next, that Monroe began to feel it. Each time he washed his hands, the water grew colder. Sometimes it was so cold it numbed him to the bone, and once, while scrubbing after an examination, he swore he felt another pulse beneath his skin, faint, rhythmic, as though someone else's heartbeat had slipped inside his veins. Still, he refused to stop. To stop would be to acknowledge something beyond reason. He told himself that the water pipes ran through the earth, perhaps touching the old graves by the churchyard, perhaps carrying the chill of the dead into his home. It was a convenient lie, and he was skilled at those. He clung to science like a drowning man clings to driftwood. Even as the water rose around him, winter turned to spring. The fog lifted, but Monroe's nights grew longer. His sleep came in fragments, interrupted by sounds too faint to prove, too real to ignore. The soft tread of footsteps crossing the hall when no one else was awake. The whisper of a door easing shut without cause. A faint humming that came from the examination room, low and mournful, like a hymn sung by someone too tired to finish. The first night he heard it, he froze. The sound drifted through the wall, a melody half remembered. The same song sung at Eleanor Price's funeral. He told himself it was the wind, but wind does not hum, and it does not carry words that sound like prayers. The housekeeper, Mrs. Talbot, was the first to speak of it openly. She was an old woman who had been with the Monroe family for years, loyal but cautious. One morning she arrived pale and trembling, refusing to enter the examination room. "Doctor," she said, "there are footprints." He frowned, impatient, until she showed him muddy prints, small and deliberate, traced across the floor and up to the table where Eleanor had once lain. The mud was damp, fresh, though it hadn't rained in days. Monroe's jaw tightened. He demanded to know if she was playing tricks, if she'd been careless with her shoes. She wept instead, whispering, "Sir, they lead to the table," but not away. By afternoon, she had packed her belongings and left without pay. Monroe didn't stop her. He told himself he didn't need her. He told himself he didn't believe her. That night, however, he locked every door and window, checking them twice before returning to his desk. He opened his ledger, turning pages until he found her name, Eleanor Price. The ink had faded slightly. His handwriting looked foreign to him now, distant and arrogant. He stared at the single word he had written as cause of death, hysteria. He traced it with one finger, and for a moment he thought the page pulsed beneath his touch. The sensation was gone almost as soon as it came, leaving him alone in the silence. But silence, too, began to change its shape. It was no longer stillness, it was presence. The clinic breathed around him now. The wood groaned. The lamp sputtered, and shadows seemed to hesitate before fading. At times, when he sat too long at his desk, he felt a chill breath against his neck, faint as a sigh. Once, while passing the hallway mirror, he saw a figure behind him, pale, unmoving, and turned to find the corridor empty. His reflection lingered a heartbeat too long after he moved. The rational mind can explain anything, until it can't. Monroe began to work less. He stopped visiting patients after dark. He dismissed his assistant, claiming financial hardship. But the truth was simpler. He no longer trusted himself. The clinic had become something other than a place of healing. He could feel it when he stepped inside, the weight of unspoken things pressing against the walls. His footsteps echoed longer than they should have. The room smelled faintly of lilies, though none were there. Sometimes when he touched the doorknob of the examination room, his hand came away damp with condensation, as though someone had just breathed on the other side. He tried to burn the ledger once, but his courage failed. Instead, he placed it in a locked drawer, whispering a small apology to no one. The next morning, the drawer was open, the ledger lying on his desk. The page with Eleanor's name had been torn clean out. The remaining pages fluttered as he entered the room, though the air was still. He felt it then, the smallest tremor in his chest. Something that wasn't fear so much as acknowledgement. He was being watched, not punished, not yet, simply observed. Judgment, he realized, does not always shout. Sometimes it only waits. The townspeople noticed the change. The doctor who once spoke loudly now muttered to himself. The man who mocked faith began carrying a small silver cross in his pocket. Though he never admitted it, the children whispered that he talked to empty chairs. The priest said nothing but began leaving candles on the clinic steps. And yet Monroe continued. Stubborn to the last, pride had built his world, and pride would not let him see it crumble. He took to drinking at night, whiskey masking the silence until dawn. In the dim light, the lines on his face deepened, his eyes hollowed. Still, he laughed when the church bells rang in the distance, though the laughter sounded more like a cry. The prayers of the ignorant, he muttered to the empty room. That's all this is. But somewhere in the darkness, a voice answered, not in words but in the quiet rustle of air, the faint click of rosary beads, the soft hum of a hymn that no one living remembered. By early summer, the once proud doctor had become a shadow in his own clinic. He stopped taking new patients, though he never admitted why. He moved through his days as though underwater, slow and distant. When the townspeople passed by, they saw the curtain drawn and the lamp burning even at midday. No one knocked anymore. No one dared. And still, every night, at the stroke of midnight, the lamp in his study flickered once, twice, and went out. He would sit in the dark, eyes open, listening to the sound of two heartbeats, one his own, the other borrowed from the grave he tried so hard to forget. Pride, after all, has a pulse. And pride, history remembers, has the heaviest tomb. Some nights, when the wind curls down the main road of Ash Hollow, it carries with it the faintest sound, the clink of metal instruments, the scratch of a pen, and a single whisper that sounds like a man asking forgiveness from no one at all. The storm came down without mercy, a curtain of rain so thick the churchyard looked like it was sinking back into the earth that birthed it. The wind howled through the cypress trees, pulling the loose shutters from the old rectory and shaking the cracked windows of Ash Hollow's little chapel. The air itself seemed alive that night, charged with something older than weather, something that felt like reckoning. By midnight, the river had flooded the low road. The bell tower groaned against its own rust, and at the edge of the graveyard, where the poor were buried without stones, the soil began to move. In the morning, a boy delivering milk found what the storm had done. The ground behind the chapel had split open, rainwater carving through the graves like a knife through wet paper. He dropped his pail when he saw the corner of a coffin lifted. From the earth, the wood blackened with rot, its edges torn open by the flood. Inside, pale as bone, lay Eleanor Price. The rosary she had been buried with still hung from her fingers, untouched by decay. The boy ran screaming into town, shouting that the dead had risen. The sheriff, a heavy man with hands used to violence, came first, followed by a cluster of townsfolk who stood just far enough back to call it curiosity rather than fear. When the news reached Dr. Monroe, he was at his desk, half asleep, the lamp burning through another sleepless dawn. His assistant had long since quit. His patients had stopped coming, but he still kept the ritual. Ledger open, pen in hand, pretending the act of writing could hold back what had begun. When the knock came, sharp against the glass, he flinched like a man caught trespassing in his own home. The sheriff's words were simple. "The rains opened the graves. One of them's yours." For a moment, Monroe didn't understand. Then the name sank into him like a cold nail. Eleanor Price. He rose slowly, his legs unsteady, the air in his office heavy with the scent of damp wood and unspoken dread. He followed the sheriff through the flooded streets, the hem of his coat dragging through the mud, each step slower than the last. The townspeople stared as he passed, whispering, the same way they once whispered about his brilliance, and now about his punishment. When he reached the churchyard, the sky was a bruised grey, the rain easing into a cold drizzle. The coffin lay, exposed, half swallowed by the earth, the lid splintered open. The priest crossed himself. The sheriff stepped aside. Monroe approached alone. His breath came shallow, the wind pressing against his back as if urging him forward. He knelt beside the grave, his hand trembling as he brushed away the clumps of wet soil. The rosary was still there, its beads slick and blackened, but something else caught his eye. A corner of paper beneath her hand, folded, protected by the hollow of her palm. He hesitated, then pulled it free. It was soft, almost dissolved, yet the writing had survived. His writing, his own angular script, the ink faded but clear enough to read, "Pray harder." For a long moment he said nothing. His eyes traced the words, his lips forming the phrase silently, as if trying to deny its origin. Then the world seemed to tilt. The air grew still, the crows stopped their cawing. The wind moved through the trees in a single deliberate breath, whispering something too faint to name. He looked up. The sky above the grave had gone still, the storm broken, yet a current ran through the air like static, brushing against his skin. It wasn't anger he felt, nor fear. It was sorrow. A deep, quiet sorrow that didn't come from the grave but from within him, from a place that had waited too long to be acknowledged. He pressed the paper to his chest, rain running down his face, though he no longer knew if it was rain at all. "Eleanor," he whispered. "Dear God, what have I done?" But no voice answered, only the soft rustle of leaves, moving as if to shush him. He thought of the night she died, her shaking hands, the whispered prayer he had mocked, the sound of his own laughter echoing in the small room like a curse he had sealed himself with. He thought of the ledger, of the word hysteria written where mercy should have been, and he thought of the water that had run so cold every night since. The sheriff called his name once, twice. Monroe didn't hear him. He was staring into the open, grave not at the body but beyond it, as though he saw something no one else could. His lips moved, but his voice had gone soft, carried away by the rain. When the sheriff touched his shoulder, Monroe flinched, eyes wide, his face pale as linen. "She forgave me," he murmured. "But heaven won't." The men standing nearby shifted uneasily. No one spoke. The priest took a hesitant step forward, his hand clutching the small silver cross at his chest. But Monroe was already falling, his knees sinking into the mud beside the grave. The note slipped from his fingers, landing on the edge of the coffin, the words bleeding into the water that filled the cracks. "Pray harder." The ink ran, turning the phrase into something else, something unreadable, as though time itself wanted to erase the evidence. When they lifted him from the ground, his eyes were open, staring at the grey sky. His pulse still beat, faint but steady, though he didn't seem to notice them. He kept repeating the same words over and over, his voice breaking with each one. "She forgave me, but heaven won't." They carried him home that way, down the slick streets and through the whispering crowd. Some crossed themselves. Some turned away. The church bell rang once, a hollow sound that seemed to echo longer than it should have. By the time they reached his clinic, the rain had started again. The sheriff left him in his study, wrapped in a blanket, shivering though the fire was lit. When he was alone, Monroe reached for his ledger. His hand shook so violently the pen fell to the floor. The book lay open, its pages warped from damp air, the ink curling at the edges. He turned to the last entry, Eleanor's. The page was blank. He blinked. The word hysteria had vanished. The lines of the ledger were clean, the space empty as if she had never existed. He felt his chest tighten, the room closing in. He whispered her name again, pleading this time, and for a moment he thought... He heard her voice, faint, calm, and close enough to touch. Not vengeance, it said. Remembrance. He closed his eyes. The word echoed through him, quiet and merciful, the way prayer sounds to a dying man. Outside, the rain turned to mist. The wind softened, but the clinic's windows fogged from the inside, as though someone were standing too near the glass, watching. Monroe sat motionless for hours, the fire dwindling to embers. When the priest came later with bread and tea, the doctor was still staring at the page. He said he was fine. He said he had work to do. But when the priest left, he did not pick up the pen. That night, the lamp in his study flickered out again at midnight, just as it always had. But for the first time, Monroe didn't relight it. He sat in darkness, holding the damp scrap of paper between his hands, feeling it soften, disintegrate, dissolve into nothing. The smell of lilies returned, faint but undeniable. He thought of her prayer, of the words she had whispered while dying, words he could not bring himself to repeat. And for the first time in years, he bowed his head. Some say that before dawn, a light was seen in the churchyard again, not lightning, not fire, but a pale shimmer that moved between the graves, lingering over the one that had been opened. Others say it was the reflection of the lantern in Monroe's window, swaying in the wind, but those who knew the truth stayed silent. By morning, the grave had been sealed, the soil pressed flat, the rosary reburied. The rain had washed away all footprints, all traces of the night before. Only the smell of wet earth and candle wax remained. In his clinic, Dr. Alistair Monroe sat beside the window, his face turned toward the churchyard. He did not speak when visitors came, did not move when the sheriff returned. He was breathing, but lightly, as though unsure which world his lungs belonged to. On the desk beside him lay the empty page of the ledger, a single tear of ink staining its corner, the ghost of a word no one could read. Outside, the bell tolled once more, slow and hollow, carrying through the fog. And if you listened closely, beneath the rain, beneath the hum of wind and memory, you could almost hear the faintest whisper carried from the earth, the sound of forgiveness brushing past a man who had waited too long to ask for it. Some say that was the night the doctor's heart finally stopped. Others say it kept beating, slower each day as if waiting for the right kind of silence. But the grave had already spoken. And history, once it begins to whisper, never forgets the sound of its own voice. The morning they found him, the air in Ash Hollow was the color of pewter. A slow, heavy mist clung to the ground, swallowing sound, softening everything it touched. The church bell did not ring that morning, it waited. Even the sparrows that nested in the chapel rafters refused to stir. The first to notice was the milkman, who paused by the clinic gate and saw the lamp still burning in the doctor's study long after dawn. Its flame, faint and trembling, flickered behind warped glass. No one had seen Dr. Monroe for days, though few had cared to ask. People said he had gone quiet, quieter than usual, and that quiet had a way of spreading like sickness without symptoms. The sheriff came just before noon. He knocked 3 times, heavy and deliberate, the sound dull against the swollen wood. No answer. He knocked again, louder this time, until the hinges trembled. Inside, silence pressed back like a living thing. When the door finally gave under his shoulder, a smell came rushing out. Not rot, not yet, but something stale, like old papers left too long in damp air. The sheriff called his name once, twice. Still nothing. The only sound came from the loose shutters upstairs, creaking against the wind. The desk in the study was the first thing they saw. It faced the window as it always had, though the curtains were drawn tight, keeping the light out. A single candle burned low beside an open book, Monroe's ledger. The ink bottle beside it had tipped, bleeding slowly across the wood, black as a spreading bruise. His chair was pulled close, and behind it, slumped like a man who had simply stopped existing, sat the doctor. His head rested against his shoulder, his eyes open just enough to catch the candle's flicker. One hand hung limp at his side. The other rested near the book, fingers stained with ink. The sheriff approached carefully, hat in hand. He touched the man's wrist, cold. But the hand still felt strangely damp, as though he'd only just finished writing. The ledger was open to a familiar name, Eleanor Price, the same entry that had haunted Whispers for months. Only now something was different. The word he had written years ago, hysteria, had been struck through, and below it, in handwriting that looked almost his, yet not quite, another line had appeared in dark ink, thick and wet as if written that very morning. Faith is not a fever. The sheriff stepped back. He knew Monroe's hand too well, the same loops, the same slant, but there was something uneven about it, a tremor that did not belong to the living. He turned to the window. The candlelight trembled. The ink rippled, though there was no breeze. By evening, the news had spread through Ash Hollow. The man who mocked prayer had died at his desk, his lamp still burning, his ledger open to the name of the woman who'd once prayed for mercy. Some called it coincidence. Others whispered that the dead had come for him, not in anger but to balance the ledger of his soul. Either way, the church bell tolled that evening, twice, once for mercy, once for memory. They buried him beside Eleanor Price under the same cypress tree that shadowed her grave. The priest, whose voice had aged 10 years since her funeral, spoke softly, almost reluctantly. There was no sermon, no proclamation, only a few lines read from a weathered psalm about forgiveness that comes when none is sought. As the casket was lowered, the sky turned the same dull grey it had been the day Eleanor was buried. Rain began to fall, thin, persistent, almost like ink. For weeks after, the townsfolk avoided the clinic. The doctor's house stood like an unanswered question at the end of the lane, its windows shuttered, its door nailed shut. Children whispered that they could see a shadow move inside when the moon was high, pacing behind the curtains. The priest ordered the locks changed, but no one would touch them. The blacksmith who was asked to forge a new key refused, saying his tools went cold whenever he came near. By winter, ivy had crawled up the front steps, and the clinic began to sink into itself, the wood softening, the walls surrendering. The wind found its way through every crack, carrying with it the faint smell of medicine and mildew. No doctor ever took his place. Offers came from Nashville, even from Knoxville, men with degrees and ambition, but every one of them left after a single night's stay in the town. Some claimed the floorboards creaked under invisible weight. Others said the sound of a pen scratching woke them at midnight. A few simply said nothing at all, only that they could not sleep in a place where the air felt watched. Years passed. The clinic became a ghost in plain sight. Windows clouded with dust, weeds overtook the steps, and yet sometimes, when storms rolled through and thunder cracked over the hills, the people of Ash Hollow swore they heard the shutters slam open. A single candle would flicker to life behind the glass. No one dared to go near. The bell at St. Mary's tolled by itself once that spring. Just once, though no rope had been pulled. The old women in town said that was the year the ledger reopened. They claimed that on quiet nights, if you pressed your ear to the clinic door, you could hear pages turning slowly, the sound of a pen scratching words that no one could read. Some said it was the doctor, still writing his confessions into the dark. Others said it was her, Eleanor, keeping his soul from silence. But the truth was simpler and perhaps sadder. The past had become patient again. Waiting, there are records still in the courthouse. The coroner's report lists his death as cardiac arrest. No mention of the ink-stained hands, or the phrase written in the ledger. The sheriff's testimony ends abruptly, one page missing. It was said he stopped coming to town after that year, that he sold his home and moved west without goodbye. The priest, too, grew quiet, his sermons shorter, his eyes distant. Once, before his death, he told a young parishioner that he'd been wrong, that some sins don't end with forgiveness, only with remembrance. Time, as it always does, began to fold over the story. The children who whispered about the doctor grew into adults who stopped mentioning him at all. The clinic remained, its walls bending inward like lungs long out of breath. Rain carved new lines into the roof, and ivy sealed the windows shut. By the 1920s, the road itself had changed course, and the house was left at the edge of the woods, where only the curious ever wandered. Those who did never stayed long. One boy swore he heard the sound of someone breathing just behind him when he stepped onto the porch. Another found a single page torn from an old ledger, half rotted, the ink blurred but still legible. Some wounds don't heal. They remember. No one has ever claimed to find Monroe's ledger since. But on certain nights, calm ones when the fog drifts down from the hills and the church bell hums faintly in the wind. The people who live near the old cemetery say they hear something at the gate. The sound of a pen, faint and deliberate, moving across paper. A man's voice follows, low and uneven, whispering words that dissolve into the air before they can be understood. Some say it's the sound of him still writing, trying to correct the one entry that damned him. Others believe it's his prayer, not for forgiveness, but for the truth to be heard, even if no one is left to listen. There's a story, too, told by one of the gravedigger's sons. He said he once stayed behind after dusk just to see. The air was still, heavy with the smell of rain. He waited by the gate, listening. At first, nothing. Then, softly, the scratch of metal against paper. He swore it came from inside the clinic, though its doors were nailed shut. Then the voice hummed, a gentle, trembling, "Eleanor!" Faith is not a fever. He never went back. Today, the road to the clinic is overgrown. The last of the townsfolk keep their distance. But sometimes, when thunder gathers over Ash Hollow and the wind carries the smell of wet ink and old wood, the church bell tolls twice, once for mercy, once for memory. And the sound fades slowly into silence, as though the world itself is remembering what it once forgot. Because in the quiet archives of time, every name waits to be spoken again. And some names, no matter how carefully we bury them, only find peace when the truth is told.